She sits above the clouds, a child wrapped in a blanket, knees pulled to her chest, small hands clasping a tiny set of offerings, a woven cord, a shard of pottery, perhaps a bead. Snow strings the air. Far below, the valley is singing and feasting. Above, the wind presses thin and absolute. Somewhere between the drumbeats and the silence, a decision made in a village square months earlier has been fulfilled. Her life has been turned into a state act, one more line in an imperial ledger. That image holds two truths at once. It is a portrait of ritual and belonging, a girl placed in the service of gods who were also instruments of empire. It is also, unmistakably, the story of coercion, a child removed from family, remade, medicated, and left to die in a place where the snow keeps time for centuries. This video promises a careful walk through 5 procedural steps, 5 rituals, that archaeologists and historians identify as the stages by which a living girl became an offering to the state. The word mutilation appears in the title because the processes we will describe involve control of bodies, enforced erasure of identity, and in some cases, lethal violence. But the historical record does not support the image of routine, grotesque mutilation as a generalized rite. Where violence can be demonstrated, we will name it plainly: blunt force blows, sealing in caves, suffocation in the cold. And where the evidence is ambiguous, we will say so, indefinito. When the title says servants, understand this: we are not talking about household maids. We are talking about girls chosen by the state, Kella, Capacocha maidens, who were reassigned from families to the service of imperial religion and polity. They were, in effect, state servants, prized, displayed, and ultimately dispossessed. If you want more deep dives into hidden histories, subscribe and stay with us through the 5 stages. What follows is grounded in archaeological evidence, colonial records read with caution, and modern forensic science. We will describe what each stage looked like on the ground, explain why the empire invested in it, present the scientific traces left in hair, bones, and textiles, and consider the moral cost to a person and a community. Ritual 1. State inspection and selection. Picture a plaza in a highland village. Officials arrive with practiced calm: a man with a tally cord, a woman who records names, a messenger with a feathered staff. The crowd parts. Mothers clutch children closer. Young boys and girls stand where they are told. The official's eye moves over faces, hands, teeth, the shine of hair. He is not simply looking for beauty. The empire seeks perfection in a narrow sense: children in good health, without obvious scars, with hair and teeth that mark them as unblemished vessels. A slip of cloth, the fold of a garment, a small missing tooth. These can be a reason to pass a child by. This is selection as seizure.
It is a political act disguised as a religious honor. For a community, the public choosing does 2 things at once. It binds the village to the center by giving them the prestige of a chosen child, and it demonstrates the center's right to claim the best human bodies as part of imperial ritual economy. The girl who is chosen becomes a living symbol of state reach, a visible proof that the state's gaze passes into even the most intimate domestic spaces. What the archives and chronicles tell us must be read carefully. Spanish chroniclers describe selections, gifts, and processions with a mix of awe and moralizing. Their accounts are useful but partial, shaped by their own agendas. More compelling, for the purposes of reconstructing bodily experience, are the archaeological patterns. Sites associated with Capacocha, the ritual network that linked the capital to provincial highlands, show repeated depositions of items and children that are not random. The selection process left no single material trace. Its evidence is social and spatial. But when we link selection to later physical markers on the bodies, a narrative emerges. Chosen girls are often young adolescents, physically intact in specific ways that the state valued, and they frequently carry isotopic signatures of diets altered after selection. To the family in that plaza, selection might have felt contradictory: a public honor, a public loss. In empire rhetoric, it was service. In personal experience, it could mean removal, surveillance, and a destiny managed by officials who saw in the child's body an instrument of authority. That official's finger was a judgment, one that could mean privilege or absence. Ritual 2. Renaming, reassignment, and psychological recalibration. After selection comes erasure of what came before. the chosen girl leaves home and is carried into a different institutional world, the Akalawasi, also known in many sources as Aklawasi, the house of the chosen women, where older female supervisors, mamakuna, preside. The door closes. Names change. She may be called by a new ceremonial title, given clothing that signals belonging, and instructed in specific comportments, how to sit, how to braid, what to offer. The repetition of ritual speech, the daily routines, the withdrawal from family narratives, all work to remodel identity. This was a social technology. The state did not merely take bodies, it reshaped minds. Renaming functioned as a way to make the girl legible to the imperial framework, one name to the family, another for the gods, yet another for the state archives. By inculcating ritual knowledge and curating sensory experience, specific smells, songs, tastes, the Akalawasi made sure that the girl's selfhood became more tied to public performance than private memory. Colonial accounts record the Akalawasi as places of weaving, prayer, and service.
They also emphasized discipline. Girls were kept from certain foods, instructed to abstain from activities considered profane, and supervised in their daily lives. Archaeological evidence is consistent with institutionalization. Textiles of particular weave associated with state production, architecture indicating sequestered living spaces, ceramic types tied to ritual use. Ethno-historic documentation describing daily routines, weaving for the state, preparation for offerings, matches material traces that point to prolonged institutional training. The psychological weight of this step is visible in the bodies that later reach the mountains. Hair strands taken from these girls often show a clear shift in isotope ratios after the presumed point of selection, a biochemical echo of the dietary and social changes that accompanied reassignment. The hair becomes a timeline through which the transition from home to institution is readable. Identity is not only what you are called, it is what you are allowed to remember. Ritual 3. Physical polishing and cosmetic preparation. In the months and weeks before departure for high-altitude sacrifice, the state's investment in presentation intensifies. We call this stage polishing because it is literal and symbolic, a ritual of grooming that transforms a living person into a public icon. Imagine the preparations. The girl's hair is washed and plaited with careful hands, oils and plant-based perfumes are applied, her clothes are repaired or woven anew in kumbi, the fine royal cloth reserved for ceremonial purposes. Jewelry and tiny textiles are tucked into folds. Teeth, a marker of beauty and health, may be examined closely. Small imperfections mark the line between selection and rejection. The goal is not only to honor the gods, but to display the empire's capacity to produce perfection, immaculate bodies, immaculate clothing, immaculate symbolism. We should be wary of romanticizing this as mere pampering. The polishing is a disciplining practice. The same rituals that create a beloved object also normalize the girl's public role as a symbol. The tight braids make movement predictable. The elaborate clothes restrict certain kinds of work. The repeated cleansing rituals inscribe a bodily compliance that will be harder to resist later. Archaeology supplies tangible proof for this stage. Textiles recovered from mountaintop burials are of exceptional quality. Fine weaving, carefully dyed threads, garments that match elite styles described in colonial records. Small arrays of personal items, weaving sticks, miniature food vessels, carved figurines, accompany the bodies. The careful arrangement of hair and clothing on recovered remains suggests deliberate attention to presentation at the time of death. In many finds, the hair is still braided or arranged in a style consistent with ceremonial grooming, preserved by cold and dry conditions.
The diversity of outcomes suggests a spectrum, from sedated immobility and cold death to abrupt, violent termination. The drugs didn't sanctify them, they silenced them. Ritual 5. Burial, sealing, and silent erasure. The final step is an ending in place. The body is laid into a pit or cave, wrapped, adorned with offerings, and left. But left is a complicated word. These are not graves fashioned for descendants to tend. They are placements meant to fix a body in a particular symbolic geography, the mountain as altar, the cave as portal. The practices at this stage speak simultaneously of spectacle and of enforced silence. Two primary funerary modes recur in the archaeological record. One is the mountaintop deposition. The girl is placed in a shallow pit, covered with a textile or blanket, and left in the open or in a small constructed recess. Her goods, Miniature artifacts, figurines, ceramic vessels are arranged around her. In the case of extreme cold, bodies can remain extraordinarily well preserved for centuries, an effect that has made modern archaeology both possible and ethically fraught. The other mode is the sealed cave or rock crevice, a burial that seems designed to disappear without spectacle. Some sites show evidence of carefully sealed entrances and enclosed chambers where bodies were left in darkness, sometimes with fewer offerings, sometimes with signs of deliberate concealment. Colonial sources and ethnographic parallels suggest that punitive burials, those for individuals accused of transgression or impurity, might have been carried out in more private, hidden spaces. Archaeologists have found remains in such contexts that bear different markers, perhaps less elaborate dress, possible signs of binding, or trauma patterns that suggest non-ceremonial death. In some cases, Spanish chroniclers described the punishment of alleged offenders with secrecy and cruelty. Archaeology corroborates that secrecy by finding bodies removed from public ritual settings and deposited in places meant not to be seen. What binds these modes together is the state's dual appetite, spectacle and erasure. Below in the valleys, festivals continued, feasting, music, public rites that celebrated the gods and the empire's power. Above, bodies lay very still, sometimes plainly visible on a ledge for the world to know what the empire could claim, sometimes hidden away as a quiet punishment. The valley celebrated, the summit silenced. In certain archaeological cases, blunt force trauma is clearly present, and the forensic conclusion is abrupt killing. In other instances, the evidence fits with death by exposure, hypoxia, or the combined effects of intoxication and extreme environment. Where evidence is inconclusive, the record must be labeled indefinido. We cannot, in good faith, assert ritual mutilation as a standard practice where the data do not support it.
What we can say reliably is that the state enacted procedures that controlled and ultimately terminated life, and that some of these procedures were violent. The mountain keeps the bodies, the valley keeps the feast. Science as witness, reading hair, bones, and textiles. If silence preserved these bodies, science has been able to pry into that silence. Hair strands become chronological diaries, isotopes indicate diet, alkaloid residues point to coca and chicha, cortisol records physiological stress. Bones and skulls reveal blunt force trauma in a fraction of cases, dental patterns and enamel show health and childhood stress, textile patterns corroborate social status at death. Hair isotope studies demonstrate a recurring pattern. Many of the analyzed remains show a dietary shift after a point consistent with selection and institution, from a subsistence mix typical of village life to one richer in maize and animal protein or alcohol-associated compounds linked to state ritual. In a number of high-altitude mummies, sustained traces of coca and fermentative residues appear in the hair as the weeks and months progress toward the time of death. This is compelling because it ties a social story to a physical trace. The girl was receiving new substances as part of the preparation. Hair cortisol adds another, darker layer. In some cases, cortisol levels increase as death approaches, indicating rising chronic stress. If a ritual is a pathway to an honored death, why would stress levels rise? Two possible interpretations come forward. Either the preparatory practices themselves produce stress, through isolation, altered diet, and institutional discipline, or the awareness, however partial, of eventual death produces physiological responses even when sedation is used. Either way, the result undermines the comforting narrative of voluntary martyrdom. Finally, forensic analysis of skeletal trauma offers unequivocal evidence in select cases. A proportion of the high-altitude corpses exhibit skull fractures consistent with blunt force impact. In those instances, the manner of death is violent. The archaeological interpretation is careful. Such injuries do not necessarily indicate a standardized mutilation rite practiced across the board, but they do reveal that lethal force was within the repertoire of methods used in at least some depositions. Taken together, these scientific lenses tell a complex story in which enforcement and devotion are braided. The empire cultivated symbolic piety while also exercising coercive capacity. The result is a set of practices that managed bodies from selection to silence. Why did the state do this? Power, symbolism, and control. To understand the motives behind these procedures, we must step back from individual tragedies and look at the architecture of power. The Inca state, like many pre-modern empires, depended on symbolic acts that made political order visible.
Sacrifice and the public regalia around it proved that the state had direct access to the cosmos.
Choosing perfect youths and presenting them at high altars was a way of demonstrating that the empire could harmonize human life with divine favor. But symbolism alone cannot explain the meticulous, costly practices we've described. There is a governance logic here. By selecting children from subject communities, the state strengthens political bonds and creates channels of loyalty. The girls themselves become living tokens of allegiance, exchanged across geographic and social divides. The Akalawasi functions as both a religious school and a center of production, weaving fine cloth for the imperial economy, producing ritual specialists, and channeling local labor and tribute into the state's ceremonial apparatus. Moreover, the careful grooming and presentation served to materialize ideals of empire. Perfect bodies, dressed in finest textiles, arranged with precious offerings. All these things signaled order, wealth, and the state's capacity to manage life itself. The ability to remove a girl from her family and present her as an offering was a visual testament to the reach of imperial authority. At the same time, the state's use of pharmacology and institutional discipline shows an understanding of the body as a site for control. The provisioning of intoxicants, the imposition of specific diets, the repetition of rituals to alter identity, these are techniques of governance as much as they are religious acts. In this sense, what was religious and what was political becomes inseparable. Colonial afterlives and museums. Centuries later, these silent bodies found themselves in a different kind of display: museums, laboratories, and publications. The preservation that allowed scientific inquiry, cold, dry mounts high on the Andes, has also made the dead into objects for modern consumption. Museum cases protect textiles and mummified flesh alike. Conservation labs study hair like scripts. Scholars map isotopes. Curators decide how to present human remains. This modern treatment opens another ethical chapter. Displaying mummified children raises questions about consent, dignity, and the claims of descendant communities. Some museums now collaborate with indigenous groups to curate exhibits respectfully, to limit graphic imagery, and to contextualize findings with indigenous histories. Other institutions still display remains with scant attention to descendant voices. The scientific imperative to know collides with the moral imperative to honor. We must also acknowledge colonial framing in early accounts. Spanish chroniclers often depicted such rituals as barbaric or pious, depending on their rhetorical needs, and those biased descriptions shaped centuries of scholarship.
Modern science has the power to complicate those narratives, but it has its own limitations. Laboratory results provide powerful data, but interpretation remains a human project, shaped by contemporary concerns. The question that endures is not simply what happened, it is how we, as modern viewers, choose to read the event, as devotion, as coercion, or as both. Human consequences: lives, families, and communities. For the girl on the mountaintop, these 5 stages were not abstract categories, but lived transformations. Selection severed kinship ties. Renaming displaced memory. Polishing demanded conformity. Chemical preparation altered perception. Burial erased presence. For families, loss was both public and private. A village might gain prestige by having a child chosen, but prestige could not replace the daily absence of a daughter. For the wider society, these practices enacted a painful calculus. Some bodies were elevated, others were consigned to silence, and all of it served imperial ends. There is another human consequence often overlooked: grief managed by ceremony. The valley below the mountain continued to feast and sing precisely because ritual required it. The public celebration was itself a mechanism for social coping, allowing communities to incorporate death into cycles of meaning. But grief persisted in quieter ways. Letters, genealogies, and oral histories sometimes carry traces of loss that formal ritual could not fully absorb. The moral cost is acute. To present a child as an offering is to exchange individual autonomy for state-defined symbols of security and prosperity. Whether families consented, acquiesced under pressure, or were coerced outright varies across cases and time, but the cumulative evidence, biochemistry, trauma markers, institutional patterns, suggests that coercion was systemic rather than accidental. The choice available to a young girl, if any, was mediated by powerful institutions that could override personal will. Where the record is uncertain, indefinito. Not everything in this history is certain. Some questions must remain open. The frequency of blunt force trauma across the entire corpus of Capacocha remains is not uniform. In many contexts it is rare, in others more common. The precise degree to which intoxicants were administered to force compliance versus being a culturally normalized part of the ritual diet varies by site and requires cautious interpretation. The word mutilation in the title implies disfigurement as a systematic practice. The evidence does not support that claim uniformly. Where we cannot say definitively, we will mark it indefinito. Our duty as interpreters is to state both the measured certainties and those places where doubt must remain. Ambiguity should not be a refuge for sensationalism, but an honest acknowledgement of the limitations of the record.
A final synthesis: power, memory, and responsibility. These 5 stages: selection, renaming, polishing, chemical preparation, and burial, together compose a sequence in which the state's claim on bodies was progressively asserted and materially realized. The methods varied: coercion and ritual, pharmacology and presentation, violence and erasure. Archaeology and forensic science have given us tools to read what once seemed sealed by time. They reveal an imperial machinery that used religion to justify power and that invested heavily in making sacrifice legible and effective. The ethical lessons are immediate. When we look at a child preserved in museum glass, we are looking at a life that was valued by one set of institutions and dispossessed by another. We must ask, to what extent did the state protect communities, and to what extent did it prey on them? How do we balance academic curiosity with dignity? How do we amplify descendant voices that seek control over the display and interpretation of their ancestors? In the end, the choice of words matters. To call these practices simply glorious sacrifice is to ignore coercion. To call them uniformly mutilation risks misrepresenting the evidence. The more honest position is painful and complicated. The empire cultivated ritual devotion while also exercising structural violence. Individual motivations and community responses varied. The empire treated some children as honored objects and others as expendable instruments. We leave you with this image again: the girl on the mountaintop, wrapped in blankets, her hair braided, a tiny bead in her palm. She is an offering to a god, a token of imperial power, a subject of modern science, and above all, a person whose life was taken from the ordinary sequence of childhood. What we have today are traces, braids, isotopes, broken bone, woven cloth, that testify to the intersection of ritual and rule. If this moved you, consider reading further in the description for academic sources on Capacocha, hair isotope studies, and museum ethics, and subscribe to support more investigative history presented with care and respect. Reflect on how societies today still negotiate the same trade-offs: security for some, silence for others, and what it means to remember people who never chose the roles assigned to them.